Hello, my name is Matthew, and I had recently had a really good reading run. I had read the new translation of the Karamazov brothers, translated by Michael Katz. And then right before that, I had read Middlemarch by George Eliot, and it was great fun. These are profound, serious, great works of literature that are substantial. I talked about them. But after finishing Middlemarch, two, also I should say, traditional novels, at least in hindsight. And I was in the mood for reading something a little bit more modern and more experimental. And I was looking on my shelves and I pulled down Nova Express by William S. Burroughs. And it has a quote on the cover by Jack Kerouac. It says, Burroughs is the greatest satirical writer since Jonathan Swift. And I had read this in my early 20s. I read Naked Lunch and The Wild Boys and The Ticket That Exploded. Later on, I had read his trilogy, The Cities of the Red Knight, and The Place of the Dead Roads, and The Western Lands. And I remember being a young man in my early 20s with my old friend Bob, who was recommending books to me. And he was recommending, and I was reading and enjoying Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy and Dostoevsky and George Eliot and all of these books. That's the time that I read The Magic Mountain. And I remember talking to Bob and saying much of what I'm thinking now, like, what about something modern and experimental? And one of the interesting things that Bob had told me is that so many of the 20th century modernist novels are actually these throwbacks to early English or French or even ancient Latin or Roman texts that weren't necessarily experimental at the time, but were innovative. So things like Tristram Shandy or Jacques the Fatalist by Diderot, or The Golden Ass, ancient Rome, or the Satyricon, and how you can see these influences in modernist literature. You can find those experimental threads in Ulysses or the works of Samuel Beckett and other experimental writers. But Bob had, I don't want to say recommended, but he talked about William S. Burroughs. He said he was terrible. But Bob hated William S. Burroughs. But he was explaining to me the experimentation that Burroughs did. He had something called the Cut Up trilogy, which I remember just thinking, like, how amazing is this? This guy is taking things that he's written, things that other people have written, magazines, articles from magazines, and he'll cut everything up, paste everything back together, and however the sentences run, just kind of through a sort of fatalism. That's going to be now the new authorized text. And I haven't read everything by Burroughs. For some reason, I never read his, if I'm remembering correctly, his two earlier novels, Queer and Junkie. But I had started with Naked Lunch and read a couple of the very experimental novels. And I remember thinking they were a hoot. Just so outlandish and really kind of getting a a thrill that it's so different than really any kind of traditional novel, and even different than a lot of modernist novels. And it's been about that long since I've read anything by Burroughs. And so I read maybe 50, 60 pages of this and was struck by how terrible it was. I then picked up some of the later books and read 20, 30 pages. The Western Lands, which is the end of his trilogy that he wrote in the 80s, and also The Place of the Dead Roads. And I was wondering if his more mature works would have more lasting power. And they did not. And they are experimental. William S. Burroughs, any of his books, they do have a distinctive style to them. If you read a page, it's quite unique. What it lacks, for me anyway, just was like a sense of judgment. And I can be thrilled by an experimental novel with innovations and whatever. In this, so much of the shock value will come through either vulgarities or sensational buzz points, drug use, just different seediness, like elements of seediness through the books. But as far as a reading experience, it's almost as if you can read any page and it doesn't matter. There's no forward momentum in the book. It reads just like random ramblings of shards of images. It gets frustrating through all of these books. I spent time recently going through them. Characters will be introduced just by name, as if you should already know who they are. There's no context or backstory or meaning. Almost on every paragraph, we just have, as the pages go on, dozens of characters that pop in for one moment and then pop away or vanish. Even if you get a character that you have a through line with, recurring characters, it's hard to even gauge what you should be caring about when 9 out of 10 people that are named are never mentioned again. There's incidents and locations and descriptive elements that are given no explanation. It's almost as if you would have to already know. It would be impossible to know because it's not on the text. So maybe like Jack Kerouac, who might be talking to William S. Burroughs, would get an inside joke. And these books really read as if they were written by somebody that had never read a novel, never had written a novel, had never told a story, or ever heard a story. Really an alien experience, and not in a good way. This isn't a writer that's, in my mind, my recent sitting. It's not a writer that is paying attention. It's not a writer that's paying attention to the reader's experience. And it really came off as just a waste of time, where I'm kind of reading the same thing over and over, and there's no momentum. And by page 30, it just as well could have been page 1. And there's hardly any difference between reading something experimental, one of his earlier, kind of his middle period, and his later works. I am glad that Bob had mentioned it in my 20s, and I remember finding them to be a lot of fun. There's a lot of juvenile humor, which um, would work on a young boy. Reading it now, though, and seeing just how off the mark it is, it just reads like unlike anything that you've ever read, by someone who seemingly had never written or read anything. And yet, he was hugely popular. He's a name. People often say, will mention him with the Beats. His books have never gone out of print. Or at least Naked Lunch will hardly go out of print. And he's mentioned with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and other Beats. I've never been a big fan of the Beats. I'm not a big fan of Jack Kerouac. And it's almost inspiring to think that through sheer willpower, you can be a successful writer without any apparent skills. There are so many other kinds of writers that have been experimental, that I've read when I was younger, that have stayed with me, have had lasting power. I almost imagine, just by my own imagination, that William S. Burroughs was reading the cantos by Ezra Pound, or the poems of T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, was reading Ulysses, and maybe got learned all the wrong lessons. The idea that it's not easy, that things don't quite make sense. There's portions that you have to ponder over, purposefully obscure references, and thinking, maybe if it's so incomprehensible, so undecipherable, that's what makes something good. I don't know. He was also on drugs, apparently the whole time that he was writing everything, I think. And I spent the day going through these books. This is a couple of weeks ago now. And it really felt like it was a wasted reading day. You can read one of these 100 pages in a day or whatever, and you're not going to get anything. It's not entertaining. It's not a story. There are flashes of imagery, and there's shocking things that happen, but nothing adds up. You just move on to some other shocking thing. And I suppose I'm talking about it now because I had still been thinking about it, and wondering what kind of thrill I might have had in my early 20s, what got lost in the mix-up now. And this is a writer that gets reviewed. Major writers will mention the influence that he's had on them, like Will Self, who's a great experimental novelist, Umbrella, Shark and Phone, Kurt Vonnegut, who I'm also not a big fan of. So I wonder if there's anything that I'm missing now. Not that I'm going to be revisiting these. I feel like William S. Burroughs had his day for my reading. But let me know your thoughts. I think he's a really singular figure. He's just so strange. And like I said, he does have a distinctive style. It's just that it's terrible and a waste of time. So, just some thoughts on William S. Burroughs. Let me know what you think. So please leave a comment below. Thank you for watching, and take care.